Good evening, comunidad. Tonight we bring you the haunting spirits of the abandoned barracks. Chilling tales unfold. 3 stories that begin with ordinary steps and end with something that follows. If you hear something after this episode ends, remember, it might just be the first sound of your own story beginning. Vale Gómez wrote to us from the pilgrimage road. She and her husband had set out late, lanterns bobbing among the other walkers, the kind of silence that belongs to long, patient journeys. The town lights melted behind them. The path climbed and narrowed, the stars bright but thin. Vale remembers the bells first. Not the steady bell of the chapel that marked the way, but a thinner, higher clinking, as if someone were carrying a row of tiny bells sewn into a veil. The sound came from ahead, and it was slow, not matching any of the footsteps they could see. She and her husband fell out of step as the path dipped near a dry wash. The crowd thinned, the lantern light left pools of darkness between walkers. Vale says she felt the air change, colder like breath over a mirror. Then she saw her, a silhouette taller than a woman should be, dressed head to toe in black, not the usual pilgrim shroud but a heavy veil that hung straight, as if the wind had never touched it. There was no face beneath. Where a face should have been was the same black as the veil, absorbing light instead of reflecting it. The figure did not speak. It moved, and the bells sang in the air. Vale reached for her husband's sleeve and tugged, but he was already a step ahead, turned by the path. For a moment she thought to call out. Then the lantern caught the veil and revealed nothing. No shadow where an eye might be. No hint of skin. Nothing for light to rest on. It looked like the idea of a woman, made of fabric and absence. She watched it approach and felt in her chest the small, irrational hope that it would pass by like any other pilgrim. But the veil stopped a few meters away, and the bells slowed until they stopped altogether. Vale remembers the sound going thin, like thread snapping. The faceless woman lifted an arm, the movement slow and patient, and then turned as if choosing a direction. She drifted off the path and disappeared into the scrub that borders the way, taking the sound with her. Vale's husband returned, confused, and they walked the rest of the night in silence. What Vale kept describing later was the certainty that the figure knew the road as well as a local. Not hostile, not playful, just present, like a shadow of whatever is drawn to pilgrim routes, journeys, promises, the weight of vows. The bells stayed in her ears long after the dark had given way to morning. If that shadow could move across a pilgrim path, imagine what hides in abandoned barracks. Santiago's story came to us in a handwritten note. Edges frayed, lines in the margins where he'd pressed too hard with his pen. He signed with his name and the town he hailed from, Guanajuato, and he asked, in a sentence that read like a prayer and a warning, that the details stay true. So I'll tell it the way he told it to me, slow at first, then all at once. He was young then, barely more than a boy, drifting after too many hard ends. There's a particular kind of movement poverty teaches you. A shuffle between places, sleeping in doorways, carrying your whole day in a small pack. Santiago had that gait. He also had Nana Meche. Nana Meche had been there before people called her Nana. She had taken him in when he was small, bandaged his split lip after fights, scolded him for taking too many tamales. She spoke to him the way old women do, authority wrapped in affection, and she said things in a voice that could make a man stand up straight or laugh until he cried. When Santiago stole a tamale from a corner vendor, it wasn't hunger that pushed his fingers into the packet. It was shame and a small, hungry gamble. The vendor chased him, shouted at him in the street, and he ran with the heat of embarrassment burning his neck. He fled across town until the alleys gave way to a place he'd only seen from a distance. The barracks had been empty for years, a low compound of concrete and iron bars, paint peeled like dried skin, the courtyard a place where cinder blocks and memories lay in equal ruin. Locals told stories about the place, some about soldiers long gone, others about a hospital wing that had once hummed with late-night shifts. People avoided it because the wind had a different sound there. It passed through the ruins like something reading a ledger it did not want to forget. For Santiago that night it looked like a roof and some walls and a place to hide. He crawled under a stack of old blankets someone had left on a pallet, damp, smelly, textured like the inside of a coffin, and the cold settled into his bones. He remembers the taste of the dust, the copper tang of a small cut on his hand, where a corrugated metal edge had sliced him. He thought he would sleep and be gone before dawn. He imagined Nana Meche's scolding when he returned with empty pockets. The scolding would be a kind of homecoming. He woke to it. It didn't start as a scream. It was a sound in the building above him, a long, wet, rattling noise like someone dragging a chain across concrete. Then came a smell he had never known until then, rotten, metallic, like old hospital rooms left closed for years. Santiago lay still and tried to tell himself it was the city's animals or plumbing, or wind through the iron. But the sound repeated, like heavy things being shifted on a second floor, a rhythm that matched his pulse. He waited until he could no longer hear the human world outside. No car tires, no distant radio. The barracks' silence had become its own creature, and whatever lived above seemed to know he was there. He slid out from the blankets, feet finding the cold of the floor. The ceiling above him held shadow, the stairwell a throat of darker shadow leading up. He glanced at his small wounds and thought, not for the first time, of running, but where would he run to? The streets had become dangerous. People watched with the hunger of their own survival. Then the footsteps began. At first he thought they were from another person. Careful, shoeless, like someone not wanting to wake the dead. The steps matched his own when he walked. There was a mimicry that knotted his stomach. He would stop, and so would they. He would move, and they would move. There is nothing more disorienting than the sense that something is learning you, measuring the small way you weigh your steps, copying your breath. Santiago tried to stand, tried to make his way to the stairwell to see who could be making such sounds, but each time he put weight on his legs, the shadow in the stairwell shifted, as if someone upstairs had just paused and listened. He decided then to stay low, to move only with the building's own slow breath. A thin beam of moonlight came through a broken window and mapped his face on the floor. He could see the tremor of his own mouth as he inhaled. At some point, the noise changed. The steps stopped and a soft scraping followed, skin on matting, like nails over plaster. He tells us he felt hands at the small of his back before he saw them. Not strong hands, but hands that were patient and cold. He turned. There were fingers, and they were wrong in proportion. Long, knobby like the branches of a dead tree. They found his shoulder and gripped as though to test its give. Santiago says he did not recognize the voice that came next. It was a whisper, decomposed and wet, and it sounded like a mouth that had been closed for a long time. It breathed into his ear and the words were clear, which frightened him more than anything. "Don't take my children," it said. It was not the voice of a warning, it was the voice of a claim. Everything after that happened like a film cutting too quickly. He tried to turn, to pull away, but the hands held him with an insistence that made his breath sting. The world narrowed to the close of those fingers and the whisper repeating, not loud but everywhere. He felt numbness crawl from his shoulders down his arms and thought for a second that the pressure would flatten him. Then, like someone flicking a switch, a different voice slammed into the room. It was a woman's voice, and it belonged to the only person whose words could pierce the fog of his fear. Nana Meche's. She had a command in it, the tone she used when she wanted you to stand up when a brawl started or quit a bad habit. This one was more urgent, broken by the creak of age and the grit of needed haste. "Run," she said. 2 syllables that were a shove. He can't explain why he obeyed. Maybe it was the memory of her hands over his own when he was a child. Maybe it was a voice that had steered him through worse storms. He scrambled out of the blankets, the hands at his back losing their grip as if repelled. He ran for the stairwell on legs that wouldn't stop. The building seemed to wake in protest. Somewhere behind him something laughed, low and rolling like gravel. He did not look back. Outside, the night was a sheet of thick black that swallowed the sound of his feet. He ran until his chest burned and the concrete under his shoes blurred. At the road he fell, full length, coughing, blood in his mouth. He lay there thinking that would be the end of him, that the building would claim him for being a stranger in its bones. A truck slowed and an old man leaned out the window. Don Benja. He was a fixture in that part of town, someone folks nodded to at the market but never quite scraped knees with. He helped Santiago into the cab with a directness that belonged to people who had seen more life than fear could teach. Don Benja gave him water, wrapped him in an old sweater, and drove him away without asking for explanations. He asked where Nana Meche lived. Santiago tried to explain. He had no direction to point. He could only say the name and shake, and Don Benja listened and did not seem surprised, only concerned. A week later, when Santiago had found the nerve to go back and look for Nana Meche, he learned she had died. She had been sick and alone, and the neighbors told him she passed the day after he left. That grief struck him with the same force as the night in the barracks. He had the strangest regret, that her voice had come for him only to save him from something else that night, and that she had not been there for her own end. He became thin with guilt, and then, slowly, with resolve. Don Benja did more than drive him away from darkness. He gave him a small loan, the kind men of the neighborhood give when they see someone who might choose life if left with something useful. Santiago took the money and used it not to vanish into the city's indifferent streets, but to rent a stall by the mercado. He learned to cook tamales and tortas, hands returning to the small, honest labor of feeding people. Where before he had stolen to survive, he became a man who served food to those who came hungry. The ironic thing, he said, is how the memory of the barracks kept him honest. Every time he felt the old appetites, for shortcuts, for numbness, the image of those skeletal fingers came back and something in him tightened. He started to answer people who knocked on his business during the late hours. He handed them a plate without question, a small mercy he'd been given and never forgot. He married a woman who loved him for his hands and his laughter. He named his first child for Nana Meche, and would tell the baby stories of the woman who pulled him out of harm with 2 words. He never claimed to have seen the faceless woman Vale described or the voice from the ravine, but Santiago did say that the world had seams, spots where the ordinary and the not quite ordinary rubbed together. The barracks had been one. It had given him terror, but it had given him a compass too, fear that redirected toward life. Between sections of his letter he wrote in smaller, almost embarrassed letters, that he sometimes smelled the barracks in his dreams. Damp blankets, rusted iron. Sometimes at night he would wake with the sense of someone copying his steps in the kitchen, and he would smile, halfway between gratitude and dread. He did not know why the building had let him go, or what the voice had really wanted when it said, "Don't take my children." He only knew that fear for him had become a lever. It pulled him up. When Santiago finished, he added a note I read twice. "I do not say it was God's hand or the devil's. I only remember the hands and the run and the woman who told me to run. If you ask me if it changed me, I will say yes." He crossed out the last word and rewrote it. "Forever. If Santiago's story moves you, and you have a night you cannot explain, or a place that smells like old blankets in your mind, hold on to it and hold on to each other. If you're enjoying these late-night tales and want to hear more, subscribe and send us your own story. One submission may be featured next episode." We move now to a different kind of echo, a voice from a ravine that refused to be located. Luis sent his account from Medellin, from Venetia, not the Italian canals but the neighborhood where a finca sits above a steep drop into a narrow ravine. He and friends were at a small gathering by a pool, people laughing and talking under strings of bulbs. The finca's pool sat on the edge of the property like a black eye, and below it the ravine fell away, tangled with trees and the sound of the city below. It was warm, the night holding the laughter like a held breath. Luis says he heard it once the swimming ended. It started as a hum from below. A woman, he thought, humming to herself. He leaned over the rail and called to his friend down the slope, "Jorge." "Do you hear that?" he asked. They both listened hard, and the sound was undeniably there. A soft, tuneless humming that seemed to come from the dark ravine itself. They climbed down because you do what people do when something odd plays under the skin of an ordinary night. You go looking. The slope was steep and dry leaves slid underfoot, the moon painting the stone. They followed the humming down to the lip of the ravine, peering into blackness. The sound was clearer now, a single voice, but when they shone a light, the trees threw back only branches, and nothing that could be a person. The humming stopped as if someone had noticed the flashlight and ducked. What bothered Luis most was that they both heard the same voice. He and Jorge compared notes, then split. Jorge went one way, Luis the other, both calling a name, both drawing breath as if to ask, "Hello?" There was nothing. A cold breeze moved through the ravine and the sound of the city returned. They went back to the pool and sat in the shadow of the night trying to make sense of it. Minutes later, they heard the crunch of leaves coming up the slope, measured footsteps, like someone climbing carefully on dry foliage. They swung the light beam toward the noise and saw nothing. The steps came closer, then stopped near the pool, and the hair at the back of Luis's neck lifted. He and Jorge stood, the two of them expecting to confront a prankster. Their laughter died when the sound circled the pool in a way that suggested the presence was walking all the way around them. But when they looked, the pool's edge was empty. The footsteps walked on soft, dry leaves, and never left a trace. Luis says they stayed until dawn, as if daylight could dispel an unanswered sound. On the drive home, he told Jorge they were both tired and irrational. Jorge agreed. But months later, Luis saw the same pattern unfold at another finca, a voice from the ravine no one could find. He began to wonder if the ravine was the kind of place that collected voices like people collect bottles. Sometimes they banged on the glass and sometimes they hummed. One possible explanation is simple acoustics. Ravines can carry and amplify sound, and a voice from a lower house could be carried and reshaped. Another is the city's life folding into a place that wants to feel more haunted than it is. Luis allowed those possibilities, but his account had the honest tremor of someone who keeps returning to the same patch of darkness, waiting for rationality to catch up with what he heard. Horrors don't always arrive on pilgrim paths or in cracked barracks. Sometimes they crawl into homes. Our next submission came from a woman who asked to remain unnamed. She wrote in short bursts, the way you write when you don't want the thing to get wider by being described. Her house, a modest 2-story, had a small bedroom overlooking a back alley. For months, she had felt watched in the small hours. It began with small things, missing items, a cup out of place, that you can forgive to yourself. Then she started waking to the sound of crawling on the bedroom floor. At first she thought it was a rodent. The sound was a scraping thighs and arms against wood. But once she sat up fully awake and switched on the light, something moved under the bed and did not look like any animal she knew. It was a figure the same size and shape as her, but wrong. Skin clung to bone as if too tight, hair long and wet, and where eyes should have been there was only the suggestion of emptiness. The thing crawled with a slow deliberation, shoulders hunched, the hair falling forward like a curtain. When it reached the center of the room, it stopped and began to hum in a low voice. Not a familiar lullaby, but a sound like water over stones. The woman later realized, with a sick sort of alarm, that the visitors coincided with nights her partner had been asleep. Deep enough sleep that he made heavy breathing, sometimes talked in his sleep, sometimes woke with scratches along his arm. The scratches were shallow and superficial, but they looked like marks from nails. She never accused him. Instead, she lived with the spectral copying of her own body. The house, she told us, became a place where your reflection might not be yours. She tried arguments and explanations. Maybe it was sleepwalking, maybe it was a trick of light. She mentions carefully the occasional nights when she would wake unable to move and feel as if something pressed her down. She is careful not to label it as anything clinical. She wants listeners to understand her fear without being told what label to wear. The figure's visits waxed and waned. Sometimes weeks would pass with nothing, and other times it would return nightly for a week, crawling across the floorboards with that wet, dragged sound. Once, she said, the doppelganger sat at the edge of the bed and mirrored her movements, raising its head when she raised hers. The hair fell back, and in the place where eyes should have been there was a flatness, like a cloth stretched over sockets. It did not speak, but she swears that one night, shortly before sunrise, it tapped the window 3 times and retreated. That tapping now wakes her sometimes, and she sleeps with the light on. What she did not do was call the police. She did not want a diagnosis. She wanted listeners to know how it felt to wake and see your own body sliding across the floor, hollowed out. She has started placing a plate of water by the bed, an old habit she learned from neighbors who believed hospitality could calm restless things. Whether it helps, she cannot say. For now, the house keeps its secrets, and she keeps hers. There's a common thread through these accounts. Something that mimics, something that removes tracking points, faces, eyes, the sound of feet, and leaves uncertainty. They are about being seen and not being known, about voices that claim ownership, about the way fear can be a doorway to something else, sometimes destructive and sometimes paradoxically redemptive. In Santiago's case, terror pushed him toward life. I want to come back to that for a moment because his story holds the emotional center of tonight's episode. He did not become a saint overnight. He fought with guilt and relapse and the lure of old habits. But he told us one thing with a kind of humble pride. Every time he heads home, he stops at the place where the barracks stood now more empty than memory, and leaves a plate or a packet for any hungry stranger. "It's the only language I know how to speak," he wrote. "I was given a second life. I cannot hand it back." Sometimes I wonder if the haunted places in these stories are less about angry ghosts and more about the parts of life that do not let you be careless. The pilgrim path asks questions of those who walk it. The ravine's hum suggests places that listen. The house that hosts a crawled copy of you forces you to watch yourself and choose what to keep. There's also a darker, older idea threaded through, that something collects what we value in ways we do not understand. Children, vows, names, the small things that make up a life. We cannot say what wanted what in Santiago's case. The whisper that insisted, "Don't take my children," may have been a claim against some past hurt in that building, or a protective utterance that meant more than its words. It might also have been a projection of Santiago's conscience, a memory shaped by fear into a voice that would push him to run. I will not and cannot tell you which is true. The safest thing I can do is offer the possibility. There are voices we hear that are ours, and there are voices that are not, and sometimes they speak at once. After everything he lived through, Santiago built a life that was, in many small ways, the opposite of the barracks. He married, held a son, and set up his food stall in a corner of the market where the light fell on his tamales just right at dawn. People liked him for his steady laugh and the way he tossed the mesa with hands that had once been quick with other kinds of movement. He hired a young man who reminded him of who he had been and paid him the kind of care he wished someone had paid him earlier. When someone came hungry, he fed them and asked for nothing. He was not immune to the scars of that night. He still woke sometimes with a start, the smell of damp blankets filling his nostrils, but he used those scars as maps, as warnings not to stray again. Night doesn't always end in mercy. Vale and Luis and our anonymous woman continue to live with unresolved tremors. But Santiago's arc suggests one thing that often appears in these accounts. Horror can be a pivot. It can fling you into danger, and by the strangest fold of fate into life. That does not make the terror less real. It makes the aftermath more complex. Before we close, consider this. Some hauntings leave physical marks, a scratch on a partner's arm, a scent that clings to a throat. Others leave marks of a different kind, a habit changed, a trade learned, a child named in memory. We should resist the urge to romanticize that change. Sometimes it comes at a terrible price, but sometimes it is also a second chance, imperfect and fragile, offered in the hollow, left by fear. There are many ways to interpret the things these storytellers described. Acoustics, psychology, chance, the mind's tendency to find pattern in the dark. All of these are reasonable possibilities to consider. I will not offer definitive answers. What I will say is this. If you have a place in your life that keeps pulling you back, or a sound that lives in your bones, listen respectfully. Tell someone. Share what you know. We have been humbled more than once by your letters. Tonight before we go, imagine a single image. A pair of hands, patient and strange, gripping a shoulder not to harm but to name a claim. Don't take my children. Imagine that claim becoming a small, absurd, stubborn force that haunts, and also in one man's life saves. If this episode left you looking over your shoulder, share it with someone who keeps the lights on for others. Leave a comment with your thoughts, and if any of our storytellers send us new details, we'll bring updates to the community. Listen for the quiet after you click away. Sometimes the smallest sound is only the beginning. Good night.